Member for Burnaby, New Westminster.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by saying the theme from the Conservatives this evening has been we care about keeping Canadians safe. Now, Mr. Speaker, after a decade now of Conservative governments where we've seen their complete incompetence and irresponsibility, around 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women, where we've seen Canadians who've died because of their cutbacks in food safety, because of the appalling incident that we saw in Lac-Mégantic, where we lack safety rules around rail safety, led to the death of dozens of Canadians. I just want to say right off the bat, Mr. Speaker, we take no lessons from Conservatives on keeping Canadians safe. They have an appallingly poor record on that, and that is something I think the Canadians will judge them on October 19th. The second point that I want to make, Mr. Speaker, in starting out is I am profoundly disappointed in the fact that the Liberals have not showed up to the debate this evening. They had 3 speaking spots, and time after time after time this evening, they simply refused to stand up and defend their position. Now, I have been following their position over the last 6 months. They reversed themselves 3 times over the last 6 months. First they were in favour of the mission, then they were opposed, then they were in favour, then they're opposed. And it would have been nice to have Liberals actually stand up and speak and say, try to explain and defend their position. Now, Mr. Speaker, that being said, I want to start off by saying my family history is very similar to so many other Canadian families across the country. When you go to New Westminster, you'll see in front of the City Hall a cenotaph, and 2 members of my family have their names inscribed in that cenotaph, having given their lives for their country. And there is no doubt that Canadians, many Canadian families have the same story. Many Canadian families have shown great courage. And the reality is, Mr. Speaker, as you know, that our men and women in uniform show great courage all of the time. It is important, though, as the Leader of the Opposition stressed earlier this week, that when we send our men and women in service overseas, that we are honest and forthright with them. This government has been anything but. I'll start with just the history of the Minister for National Defence. I'm happy that he's here this evening, but he cannot deny his record has been less than forthright when we look at his record in Cabinet. First, back in 2011, when he manufactured a fake citizenship ceremony. It was bizarre, Mr. Speaker, and unprecedented. He has never apologized for what was an essential fib that was put forward. Since he has become Minister of National Defence, we've seen a number of these fibs, misleading statements, statements that are completely manufactured. First, the photo of a woman taken at a religious ceremony that the minister purported to be a woman being abused, and then more recently, an incident that was manufactured where a Russian jet supposedly buzzed a Canadian warship. NATO had to openly contradict the minister and say that that incident simply did not happen. Now, Mr. Speaker, these are not isolated incidences because it comes into the narrative that we have seen from the Prime Minister. First, on September 24th, the Prime Minister and the government saying that Canada was considering a request from the United States to provide assistance in the fight against ISIL. And on September 25th, as you know, Mr. Speaker, and as many of my colleagues have outlined over the course of the day, it was actually revealed that the Canadian government was going to the U.S. government asking to provide options for Canadian support. On September 30th, we were told that our forces were not going into a combat mission, not going to the front lines, but the casualties that we have seen so far belie that fib, Mr. Speaker, and the tragic death of Sergeant Andrew Guaron as well shows very clearly that that statement that was made by the Prime Minister in the House of Commons was simply not true. But I think the most egregious comments coming from this government, and we've seen them tonight repeatedly from Conservatives, was the point that somehow this is a balanced approach, that somehow there's just as much emphasis being put on humanitarian aid as there are on the bombing mission. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've already seen from the Parliamentary Budget Officer that this government has deliberately hidden information from the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer and actually broken the law. And that the actual size and scope and extent of the bombing mission is perhaps as high now as $1 billion. Now, Mr. Speaker, we can't get accurate figures on that because the government has been hiding information contrary to law from the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer. But the reality is the government seems to be willing to spend unlimited amounts of money and even hiding it from the Parliamentary Budget Officer for their bombing mission, bombing people, bombing targets in Iraq, and now looking to bomb those targets in Syria. But to say that somehow the government is emphasizing equally a humanitarian mission is simply ridiculous, because the figures that the government themselves have tried to spin, and tonight we heard from the Minister of Labour that this Conservative government has fed millions of the 2.5 million refugees that are living in appallingly dire circumstances right now in areas of northern Iraq and southern Iraq. When you look at the figures that the Conservatives have released themselves, and this is a figure that we've started to raise today, Mr. Speaker, not one Conservative has been able to answer this question. When you do the math, it amounts to 5 cents a day per refugee. Now, Mr. Speaker, we're being asked to believe, if you listen to the Minister of Labour, that somehow at 5 cents a day per refugee, we are feeding and clothing and putting tents up and creating hospitals and educating millions of refugees. Mr. Speaker, that is a whopper that defies any attempt at realistic and constructive debate. It's simply a whopper compared to inventing incidences with Russian jets, inventing fake citizenship ceremonies, having the Prime Minister invent that somehow the United States was asking Canada to come in. That pales in comparison to this myth that somehow the Conservatives are putting humanitarian aid in such a way that we are helping the millions of people that are living in appallingly dire circumstances. And Mr. Speaker, as you well know, that we've had the Kurdish government and the Iraqi government hamstrung by the extent of the humanitarian crisis. And yet Canada is simply not there in any meaningful way. 5 cents a day for refugees. 5 cents a day per refugee. That is what this government's own figures tell us about the extent of the humanitarian aid. 5 cents a day. A few grains of rice, maybe a tablespoon of powdered milk. But to say that there are tents, to say that somehow there are schools being constructed, somehow there are hospital and medical facilities, somehow sanitation's being taken care of, somehow water programs that are desperately needed are being taken care of, it's simply not true, Mr. Speaker. It is the biggest whopper of all the whoppers that Conservatives have brought forward tonight. And it is simply the reason why I think, Mr. Speaker, that we're seeing that steady erosion in support for this mission since the beginning, because Conservatives have simply not been honest and forthright with the Canadian population. That's why we've seen, over the course of the last few weeks, a steady decline in support for this mission. It's because Canadians have fundamental values. They understand that ISIS is terrible, and it has created a terrible humanitarian crisis, but they can also see that what we should be doing is offering that immediate humanitarian support, not at 5 cents per refugee per day, not at 5 cents, enough for a few grains of rice or a tablespoon of powdered milk, but that Canada really should be stepping up to a humanitarian mission, that we really should be looking, instead of pretending that somehow we're building schools and hospitals, that we really should be putting and investing so that we can help stem that extent of humanitarian crisis. And that is the appropriate role for Canada. Now, this government has said $1 billion for bombing. We're willing to do that. We'll even hide funds from the Parliamentary Budget Officer. We won't be straightforward. We won't be transparent. But the reality is there are millions of people suffering tonight. They need support tonight. And what Canada should be doing, and if Conservatives support the amendment that was brought forward by the member from Ottawa Centre, what Parliament would be directing our military forces to be doing, and the government to be doing, is providing humanitarian support now for the 2.5 million refugees that are living in such dire circumstances. We should be looking at providing schools and medical support. We should be looking at sanitation. We should be looking at providing food and water, and not at 5 cents per refugee per day, which is what the Conservatives have ultimately admitted is what they're actually providing in humanitarian support, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're urging Conservative members to support the NDP amendment and put in place real humanitarian relief.